Well, this is the last in our series on the early church, and last time we looked at... Sorry, it's booming a little bit. I'm just going to... That bit better? Okay. This is the last in our series in the early church. Last time we looked at elders, and this time we're focusing on deacons. The reason that we've been looking at this series, the reason why we're looking at this evening, is thinking especially about the potential of changing our constitution to allow for female deacons, which the elders are putting before the church at the end of the month at the members' meeting. So if you're watching online as well, there might be a few that are watching to find out a bit more. This is what we're talking about. This series has been in part to help us answer that question. And we saw in our first talk that the early church had variable practice on various things, and one of those things is deacons. So we're going to follow the same outline as the talk. The first one we had, variable practice, enduring principles and various possibilities. So first of all, variable practice. Deacons are present in the New Testament, but they're not an element that is focused on. Really, there are only two major passages that deal with deacons. The one that we had read before from 1 Timothy 3, and the other one is Acts chapter 6. 1 Timothy 3 tells us a bit about who they should be, their character. But Acts 6 is the only passage really that shows us in the Bible, gives us a clue as to what they actually do. In Acts 6 there's been a crisis in the early church. There has been a split between the Greek-speaking Christians and the Aramaic-speaking Christians over how their widows were being allocated food. Remember that they shared all things in common, so the distribution of food was quite an important matter. And the church, after surviving attack from outside to try and silence them, the church now risks collapsing over issues that might arise just in a simple restaurant, if you like. That table over there has a larger portion than me. That's the issue that's sort of almost bringing down the church. And the apostles, seemingly at this point acting as elders in the church of Jerusalem, call the church together and call for the appointment of 7 men to sort out the issue. They will serve as deacons, literally as servants or ministers. It's actually the Greek word that's used for waiters, again, as you would in a restaurant. What makes it complicated is that only one task is given. This is it in the Bible. If we went on purely prescriptive for Acts, in the reading of the book of Acts, then deacons are those who ensure the fair distribution of food to widows. That's what deacons do. That's the only example we actually have. Now, no one through the whole of history has read it this restrictively. The problem is, though, what are the tasks that deacons are needed for? Whereas we have a plethora of titles and descriptions that tell us what elders, overseers, shepherds, teachers do, we just don't have that for deacons, which historically has led to all sorts of different versions of this role. So I should have told you at the beginning, by the way, we'll be taking questions at the end and leave a little bit of extra time, which is why we're sort of going through. But historically it's led to all sorts of different versions of this role. But are there any enduring principles that are underneath it? Well, like with an elder, the qualification is character again. In both passages, both the one in 1 Timothy and in Acts chapter 6, it actually tells us about their character, what they're to be like. In Acts chapter 6, it tells us that they're to be spirit-filled, godly, and wise. And really, there are watchwords for deacons: godly, spirit-filled, and wise. And that's partly because, first of all, their role is not merely admin. So even if we think about the situation in Acts chapter 6, the tasks they have been given involved people, as do most tasks in a church. In Acts, they were dealing with the fallout of a near split of the church. They wouldn't just be dealing with the administrative decisions, but with people who felt hurt and offended. I don't think either that these 7 men would literally be doing all the waiting on tables either. I don't think that's what they're set aside for. More likely, given the size of the church in Jerusalem, they would be in charge of organising other people to do this. So actually their role was to do with people and organising people. And that takes people skills, not just admin skills. Secondly, though, the reason that they do it is to allow the apostles to preach. So let me just take you back to Acts chapter 6 and verse 2. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables." So here we see the reason behind deacons is to assist the overall leaders of the church to do their work, to take things off them that might distract them from teaching and prayer. I don't think it's that the elders, the apostles, were saying it was beneath them to serve tables, but that it would take them away from preaching. Thirdly, there's no suggestion that they are to teach. That's one of the enduring principles that we see. It's noticeably absent in 1 Timothy that there's no qualification for deacons to preach or to teach. Other than that, the requirements are quite similar between them and elders. But this implies that there's no formal teaching going on as part of the role. Not because they are incapable, that's sometimes a misunderstanding as well, not because they're incapable, but it's not required of the role in the way that it is required for an elder. Why do I say it's that they weren't incapable? Well, 2 of these men actually we know are very able teachers. Stephen stands up before the crowd before he's martyred and basically takes them through a whole Bible overview, doesn't he? That's very good teaching. Philip explains the book of Isaiah to the Ethiopian eunuch. So it's not that these guys couldn't teach. It's not a second tier of people who are no good at preaching. It's that it's not a part of the work that they've been given. Theirs is an essential part of the workings of a church, so that others in specific roles can do what they've been set apart to do. So it's not some sort of stepping stone to eldership, as though, we'll do this for a while, then learn to preach, and then we can sort of move on. As though that would be some kind of promotion through a system. It doesn't work like that. We are a body, and each part plays its part. All are needed, all are vital, and none are better or superior than the others. All have a part to play. Fourthly, we see that they're chosen with the approval of the church and its leaders. Both play a part in their appointment. They're actually given over to the church to choose in Acts chapter 6. And there's the laying on of hands by the elders, a symbolic gesture setting them apart. And finally, their role is task-specific. That's what we see. That's one of the problems we found, that we've only got one task. But we see here that a need arises and they are appointed. If the problem with the widows went away, then I would argue that actually their role would go away. They would no longer be needed for the jobs that they've been given. So they're not jacks of all trades, as some are made out, sort of deacons without portfolio. Nor is there a notion that there's what some call a diaconate, sort of house of deacons, where they sort of gather together to make decisions, that also sort of acts like a separate body to the elders. I mean, I've heard in some churches it almost works like the Houses of Parliament. I've got it through the elders, but they won't need to get it through the deacons. As though it's sort of like 2 rival powerhouses. Actually, here, they're not given as the overall decision-making body of the church in the way that elders are. And they don't seem to have any authority separate to the elders, as though it was a sort of power struggle between the 2. They act with the authority of the elders. They implement what the elders have decided. They make the day-to-day decisions, of course, otherwise there'd be no point, would there? Could you imagine in Acts chapter 6, call them up and say, we need to feed the widows, but we don't know whether to serve them tomato or minestrone soup. What do you think we should do? That just wouldn't work, would it? The only time I can think about that where they need to be consulted is whether the theological problem with serving pea and ham soup to those with a Jewish background. But even then, you'd sort of hope that they'd be able to work it out themselves. So really the model is, the principle is, that the elders set the direction, the elders have the authority, and the deacons use their God-given wisdom to implement the elders' decisions wisely for the good of the church. They assist the elders in doing their work by freeing them up from church matters that might take them away from their God-given role of preaching, teaching, and prayer. But even then, this leaves us with a lot of various possibilities. Down through the ages, deacons have differed in their role dramatically, to the degree that you might not even recognise deacons in some traditions. With regard to their tasks, some have read it very broadly, anything and everything. So in some traditions, deacons effectively run the church. When I was researching this topic a couple of years ago, I ordered some books on Amazon, big mistake. They were American, another slight mistake. They're still readable, but I was surprised when I was reading through them, that as I was reading books on deacons, what it was describing was effectively what we would call books on eldership. It turns out that in the States, many Baptist churches don't really have elders anymore. In practice, there's just the pastor, who is the elder and sole elder, and then they have deacons. And in those churches, the deacons function effectively as elders, even though they retain the title deacon. So that's a very broad role for the church. They're involved in everything, including the preaching and teaching in a formal way. Some, though, down through history have read the role very narrowly, so discerning ministries of mercy to be the focus. So anything that requires help for the disadvantaged, akin to the help for the widow, and that's the role of the deacon. Some define it narrowly, but in different areas. So some have gone with what's commonly known as pounds and property. So sort of treasurers and administration. That's very defined, but that's the role of the deacon. There's a lot of variation. And with regard to who took up those positions historically, there was great variation too. So in the early church, after the New Testament, some churches actually had teams of husband and wife deacons. That was often linked with ministries of mercy. They would open up their homes together for those who are in need. Other churches had three classes of church leadership, so the elders, the deacons, and the women. That's literally the word back in 1 Timothy verse 11. The ESV, I think, is a little bit naughty there, as there's no there, and the word is gyne, which can mean woman in some contexts, and it can mean wife in other ones, but it's just the women is literally what it says. Anyway, in that setup, the deacons did more assisting the elders in their duties, and the women then focused on the ministries of mercy. So the variation was great, even in the early church after the apostles. So the big question for us this month is, should women be deacons? And my answer, personally, is that it depends. It would seem that given the lack of specific direction on the subject, we are allowed a certain amount of freedom as to the role of a deacon. If the role of the deacon is that of our American Baptist cousins, exercising authority and teaching in the church, then no. I don't think women should be deacons in that context. We said last week that those were two areas, exercising authority, teaching, that were off bounds, which explained why women weren't to be elders. But what we've seen, though, is that deacons, as the Bible defines them, don't do those things as part of their role. The difference really between them and the elders is that they don't teach and that they don't hold authority. That's almost the definition of what makes them different from the elders. So what then would the reason for women, for them not to have women as deacons, if they're not doing those two things that would exclude them from that area? On top of that, in the Bible, we have people like Phoebe, who the term is ascribed to. So Romans 16, 1 and 2 says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchreae, there we go, thank you, brother, that we may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many, and of myself as well. That word servant there is diakonos, deacon. Even there, it's in its masculine, implying an office rather than a description. A bit like the way that women can be called actors rather than actresses, and saying that says something. As well as that, the deacon section in 1 Timothy is different from the elders section. There is no section relating to women in the elders section, but there is in the deacons one. Now, it could relate to wives. I said you can translate that word that way. And those who do that, say that that is how we should translate it, say that that is how we should translate it, that it should be, deacons should only be men. They translate it that way to say that wives is what's meant. But that doesn't explain why there isn't a wives section for elders in 1 Timothy or Titus when it's describing elders. Why would it be that actually in such an important role you wouldn't then describe their wives if it's wives that are being described? Again, the counter-argument is that the section about women relates to the wives of deacons and elders. But the deacon section, if you look at it, actually seems to imply